Complicated, deep, detailed, elaborate. These are all appropriate words to describe the world of the Elder Scrolls. But worlds as rich and lived in as Skyrim and Morrowind had to come from somewhere. There are 5 main Elder Scrolls games excluding Elder Scrolls Online, and the series has developed a massive amount over the years. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanks, the evolution of Elder Scrolls. Before the Elder Scrolls games, Bethesda was primarily concentrated on sports games. Hell, they had Wayne Gretzky hockey. That was Bethesda. The only reason they even decided to shift course was because they got laughed at another developer, Sirtech, who was developing Wizardry 7, Crusaders of the Dark Savant, and had the Bethesda crew in to have a look. They actually literally laughed at the idea that Bethesda could make RPGs, or really anything other than sports games. And that one random Terminator game that's really good. The designers and developers of Bethesda took that as a challenge and began work on Arena. Elder Scrolls Arena is a first-person perspective, open-world RPG that came out in 1994. In a lot of ways, it resembles what we know of the Elder Scrolls now, but in many, it's also very unique. Designer Ted Peterson later called the game derivative, saying that his team wasn't doing anything too new in Arena. In some respects, this is true. It's a first-person game. Some of the gameplay elements aren't 100% brand spanking new, but it was on the forefront of first-person games for one. While they had done first-person games, and they certainly existed before, it still was kind of early for the genre. Pretty much all of it had been shooting, but as Arena was developed, initially as a gladiator game in which you competed in tournaments to become the grand champion in the world's capital, it evolved into a quest-based RPG format. And the most unique part about it was a huge, totally randomly generated world. And when I say large, it was very large. Every new location was randomly generated when you first entered it, so a dungeon was generated as you entered the dungeon. It was also, for the time, very graphically advanced. There was a lot of diversity in the textures, everything looked very distinct, buildings and towns, etc. And although most of what happened in the game was essentially randomly generated, it did feel quite a bit as if it was part of something much bigger. Elder Scrolls initially didn't ship a whole heck of a lot, however, through word of mouth it eventually spread a great deal and was quite successful. Directly after Arena's release, they began working on the sequel. Being they'd changed directions so much during the course of the first one, they had to do some things differently at the start of the second. For instance, they set out to make a more concrete, real, actual story. The player is sent to Daggerfall, a city and kingdom located in High Rock, dispatched personally by the Emperor. The player has 2 specific missions: to free the ghost of King Lysandus and find out what happened to a letter that was sent to a spy in the court of Daggerfall. Now, it kind of sprawls out from there. It's very branching and has 6 different endings depending on exactly what you choose to do, but it doesn't just develop in the narrative department. Daggerfall included enhanced character generation tools and continued to develop the classless RPG systems that the Elder Scrolls is basically known for. It's by no means the first, but it did do a lot in the computer RPG arena, no pun intended, to sort of advocate and develop classless systems. Daggerfall also contains a spell creation system. One is able to go through the Mages Guild to create custom spells, and it actually automatically generates some of the various aspects of the spells, such as how much they cost, in Magicka, the game's chosen moniker for MP, as well as the ability to enchant your various pieces of equipment. Armor, weapons, etc. could be enchanted in not a dissimilar way to how the spell creation system used. Daggerfall also introduced the ability to buy houses, allowing yourself to have a dwelling. Daggerfall's map is 62,394 square miles. The world of Daggerfall is not procedurally generated, or at least in the way that the original Arena world was. The development team did actually procedurally generate the world and then go in and tweak a lot of areas by hand. But at the same time, some of the areas in the game are in fact procedurally generated. This includes some dungeons, some building interiors, etc., etc. Side quests are randomly generated, NPCs can be randomly generated and are, but for the most part the game has a pretty permanent appearance. No Elder Scrolls game would be this size ever again, just because truly doing it at the level of detail that has come to be expected from these games would just be a fool's errand. Interestingly enough, they attempted to make some offshoot games, including Battlespire, which was more inspired by Prince of Persia and Tomb Raider, and another game built in that same engine called Redguard. While neither of these games are bad by any means, they're actually pretty decent games. Their totally different gameplay style and lack of an open world made people kind of not want them. Battlespire and Redguard were both being developed alongside Morrowind, and both were released during the development cycle. A lasting change that Redguard brought was a preference towards actually hand-modeled, hand-drawn, hand-touched, whatever you want to call it, human-generated art. For Morrowind, they decided not to algorithmically generate any of the game world. And although the games prior to Morrowind laid an incredibly good groundwork with a lot of gameplay ideas and a style and lore that have single-handedly influenced how RPGs are nowadays, Morrowind, I think, was the real tour de force. This is what an Elder Scrolls game is. Elder Scrolls game. They went a completely different direction with this one, developing what they called the Elder Scrolls construction set for the first year of this game's development. The construction set being exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially the tool set they used to create the world that Morrowind happened in. In developing a tool set going into the game to work on the game in the game, which, yes, is a mouthful, Bethesda essentially allowed themselves to work on a very large open world environment in increments. They tripled their staff, and it took supposedly about, cumulatively speaking, 100 years to create the world and game of Morrowind. The various systems to upgrade your character, skills, attributes, etc. were also developed quite a bit. By practice, training, or study, a character's proficiency in a skill can be raised. Practice would essentially mean doing the thing. Training would involve paying an NPC to train you, which basically was just, you didn't actually have to do anything, you just paid them and got that proficiency increase. And then study was a rather interesting concept because, like in the real world, you could find literature all around the world based on certain skills and proficiencies and types of weapon that simply reading would increase your skill level. Combat was still fairly rudimentally in Morrowind, although it was a little bit more fluid than the previous installments. Still, Morrowind was just absolutely the exact opposite of generic, which was a criticism that was levied against Daggerfall because it was still pretty algorithmic, despite the fact that everybody had one world to explore. The more hand-drawn, hand-modeled method of creating Morrowind lended to a much more human world. From curved rock formations to elaborate castles to beautiful scenery, the world of Morrowind really was a treat. It had a day and night cycle which allowed you to get so many different various beautiful looks at everything. And although the world was much smaller, there was also a bigger sense of freedom, as things looked much more distinguished from one another. Though there was a texture diversity in the previous titles, there's a real change in look when you go to different areas of Morrowind. Nothing looks the same, all the geometry is different. Towns are different, forests are different, mountains are different, people are different. And in that respect, the game really succeeded. Morrowind also pioneered Bethesda's embracing of mods, releasing the Elder Scrolls construction set for people to use and allowing plugins in the game allowed players to make and do basically whatever they want within the confines of the engine's limitations. It also is basically the blueprint for how Bethesda does expansions with Tribunal and Blood Moon, both offering new experiences in the world of Morrowind. Directly after Morrowind's publication, they began working on its successor. The Elder Scrolls Oblivion brought a lot of new developments to the series. For one, the graphics are significantly better, with amazing new ideas like pixel-shaded water, high dynamic range lighting, very long render ranges, and a lot of really cool looking stuff. Let's just go ahead and say Oblivion has some really cool, really weird looking stuff in it. Oblivion also added a significant feature, voice acting, and not just a couple of monologues throughout the main quest, but an actual real voice cast bringing the story to life. Characters had much better AI, which they dubbed Radiant AI. Bethesda developed the technology in order to give NPCs a more human-like behavior, allowing them to make more choices and just act more believably in more situations. Characters have goals and schedules, and they do things that might reflect how a person might actually live in one of these places. This technology was developed for Oblivion and then used in basically all mainline Bethesda games since then, including Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4, as well as Skyrim. The triumphs of this game were more around the visuals, the artificial intelligence, and the underlying systems of the game, as well as some of the art. But it did have a good narrative as well. The main goals of the game revolve around stopping a rip between realms that would allow creatures and horrors from the Oblivion realm to leak into the realm that contains Tamriel. Now, we can't mention Oblivion without mentioning the horse armor microtransaction, and in some ways Oblivion kind of did normalize the idea of microtransactions, which, looking back, is not so great, but it also had very good DLCs from Knights of Nine to Shivering Isles. Shivering Isles taking up the amount of time an actual game might on its own. And then came Skyrim. Skyrim finally completed the idea of classless role-playing. I mentioned that they started kind of experimenting with that earlier, and it truly does give you so much more to experiment with, in not restricting you to a certain type of play. They never truly restricted you, but they they tried to keep you on various paths. And that just isn't how Skyrim works. Skyrim's a game that sort of unifies all of the various ideas that they've had throughout the years and streamlines them. They'd always worked towards having a more human feel to the levels and areas and world, and Skyrim truly realized this in every way. It feels like a real place. The weather, the variety in terrain, the various effects that just weren't possible before Skyrim that helped make Skyrim seem more real finally came to a realization with this game. On top of that, the combat finally seemed exactly what it should be. There are still some minor gripes with it, but it feels like it's actually up to the combat of other games. That's not to say it never was good or anything, and that's not to say it's perfect either. Melee combat was often sometimes it felt like you were hovering and not actually hitting things, but the ability to dual wield spells totally switched up combat. It gave you a lot more to experiment with, giving you different combinations, and allowing for an element of creativity in your battling. Speaking of creativity, the mod community grew and grew, and Skyrim became known very much for being a mod-friendly game. The Elder Scrolls Online was vastly similar to Skyrim in most of its systems, but it also gave you a little bit more of the continent of Tamriel to explore. Depending on which faction you were in, you had access to quite a few different places that, well, it was nice to have all in one game. Elder Scrolls Online continued some of the evolutions, and although it initially launched to okay reviews, upon its re-release as Tamriel Unlimited, it became a lot more well-liked. It takes place 1,000 years before Skyrim, 800 years before Oblivion and Morrowind, and fills in the events that happened during the Alliance War. Now, the interesting question is exactly where is the Elder Scrolls going next, and if indeed when that will be. We don't know for sure, but we're quite a ways into the new console generation and haven't really heard anything. It's bound to happen, and it's only a matter of time just how much. The Elder Scrolls is a series that started in humble, procedurally generated beginnings and evolved into something huge, sprawling, and essentially defines what is quintessentially Bethesda. It also single-handedly developed a lot of the features that we consider standard in games today, and frankly, they're just damn fun. What's your favorite Elder Scrolls game or world? Do you like the systems of Skyrim but would like to play around in a fully realized Morrowind? Or vice versa? Let's just talk the Elder Scrolls in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, and if you're not subscribed, now would be a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on GameRanks.